Hello, mutated marsupials and blue jeans. I'm King Lincoln, taking a last look and review of Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy. Now, Crash is back after a long hiatus. He was Sony's mascot 20 years ago, and he's actually had about 15 games in the series, which is a surprising lot, but we're here to talk about the 3 games that started this whole franchise off. Luckily, these games have been collected in the N. Sane Trilogy, which comprises the 3 games made by Naughty Dog, if we conveniently forget Crash Team Racing. So yeah, technically there's one missing there. With that said though, I'm playing through Future Tense on the screen, which is a bonus level for Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. Now this is a never before seen in the series, and it combines a bunch of new content to make a new level. It's actually not that bad. I figured since I showed off the Stormy Ascent level for the first look, I might as well show off the other new level, and it is very challenging though. Now let's talk about the commonalities of all 3 games in this collection. I don't want this video to go on forever, so I'm going to skim much of this, but check the written review in the description if you want more information, as well as a unique review to each game. Vicarious Visions improved the graphics a lot, and these are not the original PlayStation models at all. The boxes have textures and more than just 6 polygons. Crash has a great new look, the levels are crisp and clean, enemies are really detailed, and everything looks good. The game doesn't have an option to switch to the original PlayStation graphics, and it's something that would have been interesting, but these graphics are so improved I would probably never use it. Though, they don't retain the same standout quality that the original game did at the time. Though, again, I'm glad that they have been improved. There is one problem though. Frame rate is critical. Now on consoles this is fine because you have a curated game that should always run well. On PC though, well, I used ultra settings at the beginning and had no problems until about halfway through the first game. Suddenly on one level my frame rate tanked for some reason, and certain elements in the game didn't work correctly. There was a seesaw and it broke. Apparently, parts of the physics is tied to the frame rate, I'm guessing. Now, this shouldn't be a big problem, but I was surprised that I suddenly couldn't make those jumps that I thought I could, and then turning down the frame rate, I suddenly got a completely different experience. It's a minor issue, but still something to be aware of. And this game doesn't take a beast of a computer, but just be aware that there's some issues with low frame rate / the physics engine. Now, the stories in this game are, well, weak. They're made for the 640 megabit PS1 CD-ROMs. They were limited storage and small teams, and yeah, it's a completely different development cycle. But the stories in these games are weak still. The first game has one cutscene at the beginning. The second game actually has more, and it's an interesting story about collecting crystals for Cortex with the potential of betrayal that, it obviously happens. I mean, check the title, it's Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. And finally, the third game has a longer cutscene that's interspersed with the loading screens, but it's a bit hard to hear. Just really don't expect a big story. These are platformers from the 1990s. You're here for gameplay, not really narrative. In addition, all 3 games are inventive and have a ton of different levels, unique experiences, fantastic level design, and diverse enemies. This was possibly platforming at its finest at the time. Now, Vicarious Visions, though, have tried to improve these games. While I'm sure purists might be mad, they did tread a really fine line that only really adds in new features without really changing the game that much. Perhaps an issue, but we'll get there. The biggest change is that Crash 1 and Crash 2 both now allow the player to use Coco, Crash's sister, who was playable in the 3rd game. She's now playable in all 3 games after beating the first boss in each. In addition, uncolored gems in each game don't require a no-death run that the original games did. This can make games easier for completionists. There's also the time trials that appeared in the 3rd game now appear in all 3 games. Okay, all of these are really nice improvements. Now I'll break up the 3 games into very short reviews. I go in far deeper in the written, but as I said, for time's sake, we're going to keep it short. Crash Bandicoot 1. Now, it's the originator, but in this trilogy, it's also the most problematic. Its sequels developed a number of very solid ideas for game design that luckily Vicarious Visions did port back to the original, but they're mixed. The big one is the adaptive difficulty. Essentially, when you struggle, the game will give you a little boost. Now, this works well in the later 2 games, as the levels were designed for it, but Crash Bandicoot 1 isn't really designed for that. Vicarious Visions did bring it back to the original and did a great job, but without adding boxes that can be switched out for checkpoints and Aku Aku masks, the adaptive difficulty doesn't work as well. With that said, the original Crash Bandicoot game is rather hard, at some points very hard. There's documented changes to the capsule that supposedly make some jumps harder, but I don't believe that's the real problem here. Sure, for a couple of jumps it's there, but you can still cheat the game and walk on ropes and such. It's just that the game design overall is very hard, and I'm sure that it's one of the reasons that the adaptive difficulty was eventually added to Crash Bandicoot 2. Now, I struggled quite a bit on the first game, and honestly, out of all 3 games, this is the hardest, and probably because of that, it should be played third for that reason. Now, moving on to Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. As I said, the betrayal is in the name. Now, this is easily my favorite of the trilogy, and probably the easiest. The game adds in level select, which is just a nice touch, has adorable rideable polar bears, which are too cute, and there's better hints in the loading screen and more. This is where the level design becomes outstanding. It's as if they mastered the first game and improved on it. But there's one part that, I have to call out. The jetpack levels in Crash 2 are just annoying. I remapped my controller after about 5 minutes with them and had improved controls, a better experience, and a better game. But let me ask this. If I could do that, why didn't Vicarious Visions improve the controls while improving pretty much everything else? I can do this on Steam because I have the ability to remap controls, but what about console owners? Now, there are only 2 jetpack levels in the game, and they're not terrible, it's just not as good as the rest of this game. Overall, Crash 2 is my favorite Crash game in the collection, and I think that makes it the best in the entire series. And finally, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. Now, this is the most inventive of the trilogy, though that's really between it and the sequel, as the original defined the franchise and pretty much set up everything. But I feel this one gets too inventive. There's a number of new levels. There's underwater, flying, jet skis, and the motorcycle. Oh, the motorcycles. So, yeah, the jet ski levels are a bit dull, but okay, it was something different. The motorcycle levels, though, they're just awful. They're the hardest part of the game, making them almost as hard as the original games, but just not very fun. The vehicles will never Crash's strong point, at least in these games. Now, the motorcycle levels are a race where you have to reach first place, and that just doesn't work well. The levels are long, you have to be almost perfect, and there's so many annoyances along the way, you're pretty much going to throw the controller at some point. Still, the rest of the game is also inventive and great. Tons of levels, unique enemies, and the time travel theme allows going from the Great Wall of China to medieval times with sorcerers to underwater, and it's all great. It's a lot of fun. They even threw in upgrades and more to Crash, and really the problem here is they tried too much instead of refining what made the second game work. And I have a hard time saying it's a bad move. It's still a very good game, it's just not as great as number 2. And that's really a quick view of each of these games. Though, let's talk about the changes again. So it depends what Vicarious Visions were doing, but they left a lot of stuff on the table that, well, I have issues with. The level system in Crash Bandicoot is archaic. Okay, I don't know if they could have pulled it out altogether, I would have called that out as well. But if you start the game with 5 lives, die 3 times, and beat a level, you're left with 2 lives. So really, you enter the next level, die 2 times, and continue a game from the beginning of that level with 5 lives. Why not just get me back up to 5 lives? In addition, in all 3 games, well, 1-ups don't respawn on a continue. What? Now that's just awful game design, and I don't understand it. Saving and continue does respawn all the 1-ups in the game, but why after a continue do none of them appear in any level you play? Finally, there's one that they probably can't fix, but it is an issue. Much of Crash Bandicoot's difficulty becomes perspective platforming. Crash makes insane jumps and you're forced to look at a shadow and hope to land on platforms you were aiming for. Yeah, this is a sign of the times, and honestly not one I love. I still love Crash Bandicoot, but every time I missed a jump, I remember why 3D gaming struggled for a decent amount of time, and it was stuff like that. And one other thing, the loading times seem to take a very long time. I include a couple here, there's more in the first look. Some people don't have this issue, I definitely do, and it can take me 30 seconds to 40 seconds at times to get into a level. Just a minor complaint that really shouldn't be around today. With that said though, honestly, the Crash Bandicoot collection is good. If you're already a fan of Crash, why don't you have this already? It's a great remembrance of a fantastic character. New players though, I'll be honest, this is your dad's game. It's going to have a lot of quirks that were acceptable back then, but would never have made it today, and that's because the industry still had an arcade mentality at the time, while making games for fans at home. With that said though, it's still an enjoyable ride, even if it retains some archaic torture devices. Archaic game design. Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy earns a 3.5 out of 5. I had to judge this game on the 2019 standard of gameplay and not the 1990s standard of gameplay. If you think it deserves the original, fine, but you'll then be mad at the changes Vicarious Vision did make. If you want a new game today, I feel they could have gone farther, though it's still fun and worth playing. If you do like Crash though, let me call out one more piece. Dan Ibbotson put out a fantastic video on the entire Crash Bandicoot series. Check the link in the description if you want to see that. I recommend all his work. And that's what I have to say about Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy. I'm critical because that's what I don't get paid for, but it's a lot of fun honestly. Coming up next, we'll have another blast from the past. Do you remember Theme Hospital? Probably not, but Sega surely does, and they're bringing it back with 2 Point Hospital. It's a unique game where you build and run a hospital, all without having to deal with health insurance and HMOs. Until then though, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.